From theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Stephen and Suzanne Weiss Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine and Provost for Medical Affairs of Cornell University. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
Hi, I'm Bob Harrington from Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City. And I'm here at the heart.org Medscape Cardiology booth on the floor at the ESC meetings in London. I love to use the big meetings over the course of the year as an opportunity to catch up with friends and colleagues, some of whom I somehow convinced to come onto this podcast with me. One of the things I've noted over the years is that I've really enjoyed interviewing authors who play a role in medicine, whether that's as clinicians, journalists. It really has been one of the more fun things that I get to do. And it turns out they seem to be popular with you, the listeners, as well. So I hope that this is going to be an experience of walking through a book that's come out from a longtime friend and colleague that I think hopefully you'll go out and buy the book because you said that it was such a great discussion. But I'm here joined today by Shelley Wood. Shelley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Shelley is the editor-in-chief of TCT-MD. She does have a history with the heart.org.
I was a heart.org original back in 1999 is when I started.
So you started around the same time I started.
I bet I did. With I was still in journalism school at the time, by the way, yeah.
And so it's been fun to follow your career over the years. The tables are turned here.
Absolutely.
That over the years, you've interviewed me about a bunch of clinical studies or what's going on in the world of medicine. You're a fabulous medical journalist. I've always thought that you've been one of the best medical journalists that covers the field of cardiology.
Thank you.
You have in-depth knowledge and you write clearly in a way that even we cardiologists can understand. So I've always appreciated that.
Thank you for saying.
Now I get to ask you questions.
I know I'm a little bit nervous, gotta say.
The reason I get to ask Shelley questions is that she has a new book out. This is her second work of fiction.
That's right.
First one was a bestseller across Canada.
That's right.
And also an excellent book. But this one, I think, will appeal to those of you who like a little bit of a medical mystery, a little bit of a medical background to try to explain why things happen. It's called The Leap Year Gene of Kate McKinley.
And this is the final cover, but actually you got an early reader copy. I think that's going to be worth something one day.
So first off, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Bob.
And when I read the author's notes, the acknowledgments at the end, I didn't realize that this was a COVID book.
Yep.
Until I read that at the end. And you certainly were influenced by COVID as you wrote it. And it sounds as though that time, while COVID was largely a horrible time, there are good things that came out of it. And one of the things is that you could, as you said, hole up at home in British Columbia and begin to think about the book.
Yeah, that's right. I do thank healthcare professionals in my acknowledgments, not that they had a direct involvement in too many ways with the book, but I had this really powerful sense that I was writing a book that really had medicine in its DNA. That's a sort of a pun. But that I was able to do it because I wasn't a frontline worker. I wasn't seeing people die every day and have all the troubles. Now, none of that is in this book, but I was grateful. I'm grateful for physicians generally. I have a career because physicians exist. But also, I just felt lucky to be able to delve into something like this while working full time. But I could do the two side by side in a way that physicians that were working during that period absolutely couldn't.
What always amazes me, we will get to the book, but what always amazes me is the statement you made that you were able to write this while working full time. And a lot of the people that I do interview happen to be clinicians who have had this desire to write a book. And they do it while working full time.
Well, let's just remember, I quit the heart.org Medscape to write my first novel. I just knew I tell people, I think I went into journalism because I loved writing, but I didn't think I could make it as a fiction writer. So I turned to journalism and I've had an incredible career and I've loved it. But I just didn't think I could do the two side by side. So I quit. I wrote my first novel. And then after a year, I went back working in an almost identical role. But I knew I wanted to keep writing, but I love what I do. So I really had to be very disciplined about how I carved out my day, because it was a question I interview writers too, physicians who are writers, and I just think, how is this possible?
Yeah.
But actually, it is possible, I think, if you want it, and I wanted it so badly. I'm proud of my first book, but I knew I wanted to write something even bigger, and I would say better. So I'm an early bird, and I would wake up very early in the morning to write and then start my day job.
So the morning for you was the early morning creativity time.
Yep, absolutely.
Because a lot of the journalism, while there's creativity in it, it's more fact-based and trying to make sure you got the story right.
Yep.
And writing about it at that point.
Yeah, and polishing it. I think for me, because I do care deeply about the words in my journalism, fact-based, it has to be fast, but the writing you can polish as you get a draft, whereas the creative part, the fiction, for me, that had to be first thing in the morning before I even looked at my phone, right?
So I'm always fascinated by how people do this. We were talking before we came on camera about my friend Abraham Verghese.
Yeah.
He's a very visual writer, and that if you go to his house while he's in the process of writing a book, he has it storyboarded.
Yep.
And he draws pictures and he builds his characters. And in some ways, he's like imagining this whole world.
Yeah.
And then he's transposing it. What's your style?
I do use a type of storyboard. I use a big roll of butcher paper and I try to sort of what I call signpost, because both of my books have had strong historical elements. So I will sort of know the signposts that I'm writing towards. But I get a lot out of going away from my home life to do it. So I hold up at my in-laws' cabin for a lot of this. And it's taking me away from the day-to-day. It's taking me away from my loved ones. And it feels a bit selfish. But I can get into my imaginary world better if all the stimuli of friends and husband and household chores, all those things aren't a part of it. And COVID let me do that because I wasn't allowed to socialize. So I could really take my time for myself and build those worlds without people knowing what I was up to most of the time.
So let's talk a little bit about the process. For this book, which is a really creative book in terms of the leap year, Gina, we'll get to talk about that in a minute. When you had sent me the book and I read the title, I said, what is this about? And you quickly figure out what it's going to be about.
Good.
But you pick it up pretty quickly. How did you come up with this? And did you know the whole arc of the story? Like some writers tell me, I knew how it was going to end. And other writers tell me, no, I have to see where the characters take me. What's your style?
Yeah, a bit of both, for sure. I came up with the idea of somebody who ages slower than everybody around her. And I think the idea came because I myself was feeling my age. I'm quite an athletic person, and I felt I was slowing down. Physical changes, slowing in mental ways as well. What is the word for such and such? I felt that quite strongly. But how can you stay young? If you stay young, and this really struck me because at the same time, I'd gone through some personal losses. My mother had died. And I thought, okay, you want to stay young for all the reasons that society wants you to stay young. But if you do, you will lose everyone you love. So those were the two forces working in my sort of fictional process. But then, having written a first novel that has almost zero medicine in it, I thought, this is ridiculous. I really would love to draw on my medical experience, my knowledge of physicians, the relationships I have with doctors, my ability to research topics, all of that. I need to repurpose that for my fiction. So my second book, I decided if there's a person who ages more slowly than everyone around her, let's make it a genetic condition. And that provided me with my signposts, because then I could think about, if we look back 100 years, how has our knowledge of genetics changed in 100 years? And for me, what really was even more attractive was our knowledge of eugenics, which, as you would know, is this very debunked and disgraced pseudoscience.
It comes out throughout.
Yes.
Through the sort of what I'll call the dark history.
It is. And
some of the genetics words.
And that's another way I think where journalism helped me is I love the aha moment in journalism. And you've seen us pounce on this stuff, right? You see something and you think, that's a story. And in this case, when I started reading about some of the early eugenics stuff, I thought, people don't know this. People don't know that our beloved suffragettes in Canada and the US were also really quite vehement eugenicists as well. And I thought, okay, my story begins there. I think my child with this strange, rare, totally fictional defect will be born to a suffragette. And what does that look like?
I'm glad you pointed out that it doesn't exist, because when I first started reading it, I said,
I remember this.
Medical school. Because a lot of the other medicine you have in here is real.
That's right.
And so you find yourself as a reader trying to say, okay, I have a fair bit of medical knowledge. I think that's real. But there were a few things I looked up.
Okay.
To just say, hey, is this okay? And then at the end, in the author's notes, you do reference some of the books you read on genetics to give you a bit of a guidepost as to what was true, what was not true.
Okay, well, you're going to love this story because when I had this idea and I decided it was going to be a genetic defect, I called up Eric Topol.
Yeah.
He was my old editor-in-chief, and he's a geneticist. He can help me here. And I was saying, okay.
And he's a great writer.
And he's a great writer. And we had other conversations about that. So I called him up and I was explaining what I was doing, and the line's going very quiet. And then he says, because I said, so how could you get a genetic defect that would cause you to age more slowly? Would that need to happen, right after conception, or could it happen later in the pregnancy? Could it be emotional trauma? And he's very quiet. And then he says, you're writing fiction, aren't you? And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. And it was a really great reminder that I don't need to be a journalist. I don't need to get all my details right. I need to be imaginative. So he totally gets credit for that.
I don't want to give too much away because I want people to read the book, but that is where the leap year comes in. The kid is born on
February 29th.
February 29th.
That's right.
The leap year.
Yeah.
And so that's the theme that gets carried throughout. And the leap year gene is not real, as best we know.
As best we know.
As best we know. But as you point out, as time goes on over the course of, I'll call it many years, new knowledge is becoming.
Oh, yeah. And you asked me what was my process. I did not have the whole story in my mind. I knew I wanted it to span a kind of the history of the eugenics movement, but I knew I wanted to bring it up to modern day because we've reached the point where we actually can edit our genes.
We're doing CRISPR technology.
Exactly. So I knew I wanted it to end there. And I also knew, this was a tip I got from another writer, that you might not know what you want your ending to be in terms of plot, but you maybe want to know how you want to leave people feeling. So I had a very strong sense of how I wanted people to feel at the end of the book. And it almost was this beacon to write towards.
Oh, isn't that
took a while.
And do you, when you write a book of that length in terms of the years, it becomes a long book.
Oh, yeah.
And
too long.
When did you know it was going to be a long book as opposed to
I knew it was.
I'm going to cut this up here. You couldn't do that the way the approach you took.
No. And I would say the reason I knew it was going to be a long book was because it became long. And then my writing group told me it was too long. And then when my agent tried to sell it to publishers, they said they wouldn't take it. It was too long. Yeah. So actually, this final book is half the length of what I wrote, which is so awful because I'm an extremely efficient person. This was an inefficient process.
And that was the work of your editor plus you? Mostly your editor?
Mostly my agent when she was trying to sell this book. And then, yes, I worked with different editors along the way to get it shorter.
Yeah. Oh, that's remarkable.
It's awful. It's a terrible process. I mean, I edit people's work all the time. Yeah. I'm ruthless. With my own work, it was very, very hard because you need to lose characters that you now know well as if they're friends. You need to take whole plot arcs and do away with them. And that's hard.
He told me something very similar that, as you know, his books
is
are
very long.
And he has
which I love
leaving pieces out. Because of what you described, you become attached to the character.
I was reading his book, his latest book, at the time that my book was being widely rejected. And I just kept thinking, Abraham got to write a long book. How come I... But an editor who was really helpful for me said, this book isn't meant to be that long. It's too much. I had a huge portion in here about the Human Genome Project. She said, it's too much. That's a different book. I had a huge amount of it set in apartheid South Africa. Because whenever has there been a eugenic experiment on such a scale? That is really not in the book anymore. So, yeah, the editing process is hard. And I apologize for every journalist who I've ever hacked their piece up before, as I've got a taste of it now.
Well, you made reference to South Africa. And this book also, in addition to taking place over time, takes place around the globe.
Yes.
And I had mentioned to you that I'm a big fan of Southern writers in part because I love their ability to evoke a sense of place.
Okay.
I was amazed at how many places you described.
And did they feel authentic to you?
They did.
Okay.
Many of them I've been to, Germany, Paris, India. And so I felt like I knew where you were going, but I was really impressed. I've been to these places and I'm not sure I could evoke that sense of place.
Yeah,
How did you do it? Did you have to go visit them again?
Well, I couldn't because of COVID. I even got a grant from an arts council to pay a visit to Berlin because I've only been to Berlin once. And actually a huge part of part 2, which is set in Berlin, had originally been set in Paris. And that was one of the big rewrites I had to do. But I have spent quite a bit of time in India. I have spent a lot of time in France. And I really wanted this book to feel international because my first book was very much a Canadian book about the Dion quintuplets. It's a very Canadian story. But I think the themes in this book affect everyone. This isn't something that's unique to one population, although different populations have been subjected to the kind of othering that I was concerned about in this book. But I like to think that this is a gene that any one of us could have been, quote unquote, afflicted with, and what that might be like for anyone to imagine themselves in Kit's shoes.
And she moves in part to stay one step ahead.
Yeah, to stay hidden.
Knowing about her.
Yeah.
And her family is very conscious about, that what's the phrase that you use, bringing them into her secret.
Yeah.
And so they move, and in some ways staying, a step ahead of the law, if you will.
Yeah.
Because she does also have to stay a step of the law with things like birth certificates. I was really impressed by the amount of detail that gave me both the sense of place and her being in that place, and particularly being in places which you couldn't possibly have visited, like Berlin in the days of the Nazis.
That's research, right? That's immersing yourselves. And I think this is funny because this is my second book. My first book did well. I should have known that this would pay off for me. But when you're doing all that research and you're just absorbing and you wonder is this thing even ever going to get written? I find that part really hard. And other writers, I think, come to make peace with that it will pan out for them if they just lie around reading for months on end, that this will become art at some point. But I feel I did so much reading and research that never made it into the book, but hopefully it absorbed itself somehow into my mind that gave those places a sense of realism.
For the next book.
Maybe. Or I like to think that it wasn't a waste. It helped make me better. It helped make me stronger.
Yeah, I mean, your sense of place is one of the things that definitely stuck with me, and in the places that I knew well.
Oh, good.
You threw Stanford in there a few times.
And that's important. Well, that's importantly because that's where CRISPR was getting off the ground. So, yeah.
So it was good for me to see the different places that I knew well, and
I hope you didn't think I wasn't just planting that so that I could get on your podcast.
So that I could read it. But,
right.
The clinical trials world, working with industry, doing clinical trials. I mean, as I was reading it, I was smiling like, oh,
good.
About this stuff.
Good. Well, that's where I wanted to use, I'm not a physician. For me to learn about genetics was very difficult. I think I took grade 10 biology or something and managed to scrape through on chemistry to get through high school. But I don't have that background. And I was doing things like Coursera courses to learn about DNA again, because I just, it's lost in my head if I ever knew it. And so the fact that the other things could come through with a little more authenticity, I understand how clinical research works. I understand the jeopardy in there as well as the yield.
You have to understand the conflicts and commercial versus science and how that goes. Yeah. Well, we're coming near the end here, but I have to ask the question, what's next? You got to take a break for a little bit and promote your book, obviously critically important. Yeah. But is there another idea that you want to? I have a couple ideas. Okay. One of them that I really want to work on is I'm not about to tell you what the book is about, but I had to spend too much time at my computer with this book. It took 5 years to write. As you know, I work full time. It's too much time sitting. So one thing I really want to do is try to see if I can write a book not at my computer. So longhand, or at least taking notes. So that's one goal. I also want to write a book that covers a much shorter period of time, because 100 years is, I really bit off a lot there. It is a lot, because you have to think about the place 100 years ago versus the place today. You need to jump your readers through time, which for me, some of that I wrote to connect those and then threw a lot away. But I think when I read a book and the author drags me forward a couple decades, you do feel a sense of loss for the knowledge you will never have of what happened in between. So I hope I did that in this book and it was intentional, but it is hard to do. And I think it's hard as a reader. Some readers won't stand for it. They don't want to be yanked through history that fast. One of the things I thought you did really nicely that I wasn't sure when I saw the first one is the obituaries. Okay. But then I started realizing what you were doing is helping me go forward by marking the death of a character. And also, I liked the idea that Kit, the principal character, collected these over her long life, that for her, they were a way of putting a marker down. Yeah. So some of those would have been ones she collected. I had to cut a lot of obituaries. I had so many other ones in there, which I thought were there were some good ones. I won't give it away, but there's some terrific ones. Okay, good. With little quips and... So I'm an obituary reader. Yeah, I must say I've started becoming one myself. The Irish Sports page. And so I started doing it as a young person. And in fact, one of my patients gave me a book once called The Great Lives, if you've not read this. I think I've heard of it. This is obituaries that are in one of the London papers. And it's regular people as well as famous people. Okay. And sometimes the regular people obituaries are much more interesting. I'm amazed that I can get misted up over the obituary of a person I have never met and never would have known. I read them every day. Yeah. Well, it reminds us of our mortality and of the people we are ourselves going to lose at some point. Yeah. Well, Shelley, thank you. Thank you for joining us here on the Heart.org. It's a fabulous book. I hope that... Thank you so much, Bob. read it. I'm somebody, you and I have talked about this. I'm a big reader. I have to read to separate myself from everything else I'm doing all day long. And it gives me great pleasure to read, usually at the end of the day.
Nice.
And so I really appreciated having this. So thank you for producing it, and good luck with the tour.
Yes, thank you.
Good luck with what you're going to do next.
I really appreciate you inviting me on here. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Shelley for joining us here and talking about her book. And thank you for joining us today on the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a moment to like, subscribe, or even better, write a review for us. This gets us to meet and reach more healthcare professionals. And if you didn't enjoy it, tell us why. We're always looking for new ways to bring things onto the podcast, and your feedback and engagement is really appreciated. So thank you.